This video we'll be covering wrapping the rubber band core with yarn. Before we do that though, there's one thing I want to mention, and I didn't mention earlier, should have been in the initial video, was along with the circumference restrictions on the baseball and beetles, they also have a restriction on the weight. So you got to be careful of that. So when you cut your leather and get it all punched out, put it on a scale. I have a little kitchen scale that I use. And generally what you'll find is, unless you're using a really, really thick or really, really thin leather, most of the time this is going to come in somewhere between 3/4 of an ounce and an ounce. And the restriction in beetles for an 1860 ball anyway, the maximum is 10 ounces. I'm sorry, 6 ounces with a minimum of 5 3/4. So that roughly, if you figure this about an ounce, usually if you go all 7 inches circumference on the rubber band ball, that's about 3 ounces, but you'll want to weigh that as well. This one's 2 7/8. So between these two things, we're sitting roughly, if it'll stay, and it won't, there we go. We're sitting at about 3 3/4, 3 7/8 roughly. So just under 4. So we got about 2 ounces to work with on the yarn, and that's been typical of what the baseballs I make have been. This is usually around 3. With the leather I use, the lighter leather, this will be 1, and I can bring this in right at 2 ounces or a little less when I do the yarn. But have a kitchen scale handy is where I was headed. Measure the weight of these things as you go along and try and stay within those guidelines. Obviously, if you go a little bit over or stay a little bit under, no one has a scale at the games, no one has a measuring tape at the games. But just from an accuracy standpoint, authentic standpoint, try and stay within those guidelines. So pick up a little kitchen scale that will measure in ounces, and you'll be just fine. So now let's get on with wrapping the rubber band ball with yarn. The reason let me step back again. The reason I cut the leather first, it's kind of important, is that before we would always wrap the ball with yarn, and then we'd go and cut the leather, and we'd hope that the two things kind of came out together and worked out well. But what I found over the last year or so, as I've been making them, that if I have the leather piece handy, and I've got a core here that I've done, I can say, well, am I done with this core, or do I need to keep going? Do I need to take the yarn off? If you've got the leather piece already cut, I can kind of lay this in here. I can kind of fold up the leather piece, and I can say, well, you know what? I got some overlap here. I need to make this a little bit bigger. So before I finish this, I can keep wrapping. I can wrap a little more yarn, and then just keep testing it with this pre-cut piece of leather. So that's why I like to have this leather piece done first, so I don't have to guess at where I need to end up. I can just keep putting this on here, keep wrapping yarn until, okay, that's exactly where I want it, and then I can stitch it all up. So that's why I like to have this done first. So now let's get to wrapping this with yarn. And you can see at my feet there's a box. You're probably wondering why there's a box there. And it's to put the yarn in. The first time I did this, I didn't have a box. And as I was wrapping the ball with yarn, scoot over here, as I was wrapping the ball with yarn, the skinny yarn was just scooting all over the floor. So just by putting it in this box, as I pull on it now, instead of it rolling all over the floor, it stays within the box. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to start by laying the end of the yarn here, and I'm just going to fold it around, hold that piece down, and then just keep turning the ball, pulling the yarn, turning the ball, pulling the yarn. What you don't want to do is just wrap in one spot. You'll get these humps, these bumps, these lumps. And other than Dr. Seuss might like that, the baseball won't care for that. So just keep pulling the yarn out, pulling it, wrapping it, pulling it, turning it, and you want to pull this tight. You want to get to this where you can just pull the yarn tight. You don't want it loose, unless of course you want to make a softer baseball. Then just feel free to wrap as you wish, and the ball will soften up much quicker because the yarn won't be tight. But I like to pull them tight, pull it tight, pull it tight. If you remember from the first video when we talked about equipment and materials you're going to need, I mentioned, I don't have it over here right now, but I mentioned the sports tape, and this is where it comes in handy. As you do this more and more and more and wrap, and you're pulling this tight, and you get mixed in with some of the crochet yarn, as you can see with this string pulls across your finger here, and I actually got a band-aid here, but from previous times, after a while the string just wears on your skin and it ends up either creating a blister or an abrasion, and I have at times caught myself where I find the yarn getting red spots from the blood, so I tend to cheat a little bit, and normally I'll put that sports tape on certain parts of your finger, and once you've done, like it just, even as far as I have, I can feel on each finger where that problem spot is, and then I can just put some sports tape on it. So before I'm done with this ball, I'm probably going to end up with some sports tape on my fingers. So anyway, I'm going to keep turning this ball, I'm going to keep pulling the yarn tight. Again, I don't want a pattern per se, I want this thing to just keep, oops, I'm kind of losing it here. I want to keep pulling tight, keep turning the ball, moving the yarn around. Again, it's kind of like when you made the rubber band cord, you want to try to keep the shape as round as you can. And what you'll find is if you don't wrap and turn, you just keep wrapping, you build up those little spots on the baseball that tend to put it out around. And again, like making the rubber band core, it's the same process over and over and over, and so I'm going to take some liberties here and stop and come back, stop and come back, so you don't have to watch the same process over and over. So if you recall from the first video, I also talked about adding into my repertoire some of this crochet thread, and I'm going to get to a point here very soon where I'm going to show you that. I just want to get this far enough along. What I usually do is try to get this to a point where I don't see any more of the rubber band ball underneath there. I'm just seeing yarn. And if you want to measure it to kind of get an idea, yeah, I'm sitting at just under 7.5. So once I get this ball to about 7.5 around, and remember our goal is we're going to have a 9.5 inch circumference cover, so we want to stop just short of that. So I'll get this to about 7.5, like I said, part way to the final ball. But I want to bring in and kind of tighten this down a little bit, and use the crochet yarn or crochet string. It's a very, very thin string, and you'll see that as I get going. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop here, and I'm going to cut this. Hold this down here. Could put a piece of tape across there if you want. Hold that in place. Now I'm going to bring in the crochet thread. Let's just find where here it is, where the end of the string is. You can see this is very thin. And I'll kind of hold this here, and hold this here. You can see the difference. Well, I don't know if you can see it down there. The difference here. This is a number 4 worsted yarn, and so this would be something more like a number 1, if you will, if you could find a yarn that thin. But it's just called crochet string, or crochet thread. And I'm going to go over the top of that piece I held down, and in the same way, I'm going to wrap around here, and you can't even really tell sometimes it's on there because of the color. And if I was using a dark yarn first and then this lighter colored yarn, you'd see it show up a little better. But for right now, oh boy, hey, this isn't good. Take a break here for a second. I got a knot in the string here, and I want to cut that out. I don't normally want to do that because it takes away from how tight I can pull this string. But the general idea is, I'm putting this lighter or a thinner thread on here because I can really pull this tight, tighten down that first layer of the number 4 yarn I was using. I don't need a lot of this, I just need enough to hold everything in place. Okay, so that should do it. I don't know if it's going to show up on the video or not, but I've now got this thin layer of crochet thread holding this all in place, and as I press on this now, it doesn't have a lot of give. It made it a little bit tighter. So I can take this back out. I'll go right back to this thread, or this yarn. Oops, be careful here as I get the right end. And I'm just going to lay that over the top. Again, I could put a piece of tape on there to hold it if I wanted. As long as I get it in the right spot, I'll be fine. And I'm just going to go right back to as when I started, when this was just a rubber band ball. Just pull tight, rotate the ball, pull tight, rotate the ball. Just keep turning that thing, turning that thing. And I'm going to get this to a point, again, where we're probably going to be pushing 8 3/4 by the time I get to the next step. I'm going to keep putting this yarn on, putting this yarn on. Oops! And that may happen. Pick it back up. If that thing rolls all the way across the floor, that sucks. Because you lose all everything you've done here. So it's nice if you can keep the box under your feet. Sometimes it'll land in the box. It won't roll away. So anyway, I'm going to keep doing this until I get to probably about 8 3/4, which I still got a ways to go yet. I'm not even hit 8 yet. And then I'm going to cut the string, and I'm going to go back to some more of this crochet thread, and I'm going to end up looking something like this. Okay, we already put this one up against this leather. I know I need to go more on this. I did that on purpose because I want to get to where now I add this wool yarn. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this and get it out of the way. I'll come back and finish that another time. So this wool yarn that I use, it's called Patrons. It's a worsted yarn, but it's 100% wool. You're not going to be able to see it on here. But just to give you an idea, this whole skein of yarn when I bought it, and this is a big one, it's one of the biggest ones you can buy, it's like almost a pound, was around $7 for that whole pound. This is probably a fourth of that, and they paid $7 for it. So again, I mentioned before, if you really want to use a lot of wool yarn, it's just going to add to the cost of what it costs to make the baseball. And so what I am hoping to find, because I'm just starting to do this, I just sent out an order. Actually have 30 baseballs going to the state of Michigan here. 1867 balls, and I'm doing this process. So hopefully they'll find out that it's a little nicer ball. But now I know I need to make this a little bigger to fit this pattern that we made. So I'm just going to start now here with this 100% wool yarn, and it's no different. You just pull it tight, keep wrapping it around it, pull it tight, and here you can see with the different colored yarn, the top yarn being a little darker, you can see where you've covered, and you kind of get an idea of, okay, there's a spot right here that doesn't have much yarn on it, I better turn it, try and cover that. Gives you a good visual way to make sure you're getting good coverage of the yarn in the right spot. So here I'm just going to keep wrapping this and wrapping this. I'm not going to have a huge layer of this. I want just enough to kind of protect it from the bat, if you will. The wool yarn will cover the rest of the ball. Give it a little more spring back when the ball hits. And so as I'm going now, this is where this comes in handy, having this. I measured it before, and it was a little bit too small. So now you can see where these tips all come together. Yeah, I'm getting real close there. Those tips are starting to overlap a little less, but I can go a little more, I think. So let's do that. Let's keep going. Having the ball a little too small is better than having it much too big, because when you're sewing up the ball and you get to the end and you're going down that last lane for the stitching and you realize, oh crap, I'm not going to be able to sew this thing tight, that's no fun. There's no fun in that at all. Because you got to tear it all apart, cut out all the stringing you've done, and take the ball apart, make it smaller. But if it's too small, you see right away before you start what the problem is. Now this leather doesn't stretch much, so I don't want to leave too much gap. It's really going to be hard for you to see, but you can see those points are really close together now, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I didn't expect that. I actually pulled it so hard it broke. So now it comes to a point, and I'm just going to step away a second. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. This is kind of an optional step, and I mentioned you could tape it along the way. I have some Scotch tape, and I just want to hold this in place right now since I broke the string. Just pulling it. But before you stitch it up, there's a step you can add that I have found, even though it's probably not anything they would have done in 1860. It just makes it easier to stitch the ball, and that is actually covering the ball with Scotch tape. And the reason that is I'll kind of show you as I put this on here. I put these pieces of tape on it, and again, this is up to you, you don't have to do it. But as you cover this ball with the tape and you're sewing it up, the needle won't get caught under these little strings from time to time, and it really makes it harder to stitch up. So by putting the masking tape on it, if you can get past the unauthenticity of that, actually makes stitching the ball up easier. So I just put enough on here. I need to cover every single square inch of it, but just enough. So as you're sewing through it, there's less chances of catching that needle on the thread. So just kind of push that all on there tight. And you'll just find as you stitch the ball up in the next step, it's going to be a lot easier. So this covers taking the rubber band ball, covering it with, in this case, 3 different types of yarn or thread to make the final cord that we're going to sew up inside of the ball. So the next video I show will be actually stitching the ball up. Before I move on to that though, let's measure this. The reason I do that is if this ball turns out, that'll give me an idea that this is the right size to make. So that's going to be interesting because I'm sitting at 9 3/4 with a 9.5 inch cover. But it looks like it's going to stretch enough that I'll be able to cover that. So we'll make a note of that this ended up 9 3/4 around. 9 5/8, and with the stretch we get out of the leather, that's 9.5 or a little more. I think we're going to make this work. So it's always good to measure that and make a note of it, because the next time you're making a ball, if you use this pattern over and over and over, you'll know what size to make this ball, or at least generally how close you want to get to it. So 9 5/8 for that.